The government's about to bow to years of pressure from the European Court of Human Rights and allow thousands of convicted prisoners to vote in our elections, despite the Tories being against such a measure for many, many years. Later this week, the coalition will announce which prisoners will get the right in a move that's bound to cause disquiet on the Tory backbenches and maybe even the wider public. No doubt you'll let us know in your emails. Here's Anita with the background.
Well, Andrew, David Cameron is said to be absolutely horrified by the idea of changing the law, but reluctantly accepts there is nothing he can do about it. Let's go back in history. It was back in 1870, under the Forfeiture Act, that prisoners were denied the vote. And the ban was maintained after the 1983 Representation of the People Act. However, following a legal challenge brought by one John Hurst, a man convicted of manslaughter, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the ban was, in fact, in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, although it did rule that each country could decide which offences should carry the restrictions. Now, following the ruling, the previous government undertook a series of consultations on voting rights, but nothing was ever actually decided, and that led to the Council of Europe warning the government that it risked substantial compensation claims if it did not rule on this issue. Now, this is a particularly tricky matter for the coalition. The Liberal Democrats are in favour of allowing some prisoners to have the vote. The Conservatives, on the other hand, they are against any reform. Speaking back in 2009, the then Shadow Justice Secretary, Dominic Grieve, said, "Civic rights go with civic responsibility, but these rights have been flagrantly violated by those who've committed imprisonable offences." The move is particularly galling for Eurosceptic Conservatives. Writing on his blog, the prominent backbencher Douglas Carswell has said that Euro resentment smoulders. Well, speaking to the BBC earlier, Juliet Lyon from the Prison Reform Trust said the move is going to concentrate the minds of MPs who have prisons in their constituencies.
Prisoners have an awful lot of time on their hands. There isn't enough constructive activity, and they have more time than probably the rest of us to think about things like voting, who you'd vote for. And before the election, I was involved in a number of debates in prisons, often organised by prisoners themselves, where they were really interested and engaged with the issues. And it's certainly something that should mean that constituency MPs take a more active interest in their own prisons.
Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP and Eurosceptic Bill Cash and the Liberal Democrat backbench spokesman on Home Affairs, Tom Brake. Welcome to you both. Bill Cash, why do you think the Prime Minister changed his mind? Was it because he felt the European law left no alternative, or was he under pressure from his Lib Dem partners?
I think it was probably the latter. I mean, we've heard him say that he was horrified, but actually this is a very deep question. We've also heard just now what Dominic Grieve said. It was unequivocal. And also, in the manifesto, following the policy I established when I was Shadow Attorney General, we say we will repeal the Human Rights Act. I mean, this movement from that position to this position is absolutely huge. It's a matter of principle.
The idea of replacing the European human rights legislation with the British human rights legislation, which was at one stage your party's position.
In the manifesto.
That is dead in the water.
Well, I don't think it is, actually. And as a matter of fact, Lord Judge, who is the Lord Chief Justice, after all, very recently made a speech in which he said that even our courts, and he said my brothers and sister judges, are actually themselves oversighting Strasbourg precedents. And he said we must beware in the context of the extent to which we were automatically accepting Strasbourg decisions. So it goes right to the top.
I understand that, but I see no movement from this government to produce a British Bill of Rights.
Well, Tom will be able to answer part of that question. I can answer it from the Conservative point of view, which is that I will certainly insist upon it, and I would have said that we also should be repealing the Human Rights Act as well.
All right,
but Tom can answer for the Liberal part of the coalition.
And I'm sure he will. Let's come to him now. Why do you think the Prime Minister really did a massive U-turn on this?
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been put in a position where he's got no alternative. It's very clear that the legal arguments were strong for this to happen, and that if he took no action, and the previous government failed to take any action over the last 6 years, then the British government was going to be liable for very high compensation claims. So I don't think it was the Liberal Democrats.
You don't think it was the Liberal Democrats? You think it was the legal process?
I think it was the legal process that left him no choice.
Well, I don't agree with that. Not at all. I mean, actually, I've been looking into it, of course, and we've got prisoners voting in 16 countries throughout the world. Some of them vote in 13 countries and they can't in another 13. So a lot of the discussion we've already heard this morning on the BBC and other programmes is rather misleading. Furthermore, the question of what the government was doing in the last Labour government, they had 2 consultation papers, utterly inconclusive results. And when the Labour government itself, Michael Wills in this case and Lord Faulkner were saying that this was not something which should be allowed, and now we have a change. It's really a deep question. It's about parliamentary sovereignty as well.
I mean, he's not talking about the substance of the issue. We'll come on to that in a minute. He's
saying it's money.
That under due process, this country would have faced huge fines from the European Court if we hadn't proceeded.
Well, that's where the threshold...
Absolutely. And I'd like to ask Bill what evidence he has got to support what he's suggesting, that the Liberal Democrats were pressing for this in the government. I'm not aware of any such evidence.
It's not a question of evidence, it's a question of attitude.
Well, I think evidence
and we
is
know,
important.
well, wait a minute.
It wasn't in your manifesto, was it, that prisoners should get the vote? You didn't campaign on that.
What we have said is that I think there's an inevitability about it, but there needed to be very clear safeguards in terms of which prisoners were allowed to vote, and we're very clear on that point.
Well, we know across the world there are... I mean, my research here says there are 28 other European nations actually allow prisoners to vote, but Russia and Japan exclude, and the situation varies in the United States. There's
2 states.
Only 2, and 2 states in Australia. So what is wrong with giving at least some prisoners the vote?
Well, I do think that is an important question, and it's what I just mentioned about sovereignty. When I put forward my proposals about
what's the answer to my question?
The answer to the question is very simple, which is that we can probably find a threshold, but it should depend on a Westminster enactment and not on a Strasbourg court decision. We should decide it in Parliament as a matter of British law, and then our judges should be enabled and required to give effect to British law and not just to the European.
I understand that. So in principle, you're not against giving prisoners the vote then, provided it's done by Westminster. Do you have a view formed yet on what prison... Because as I understand it, the ruling doesn't force the government to allow all prisoners to have the vote. It's just got to say which ones. Now, do you have a view who should get it and who shouldn't?
Well, I think we've got some common ground here in that I think if we can agree that there should be a threshold and the government is looking to prisoners who've been sentenced to 4 years or more, and I think that may be the right level, but it's going to be somewhere on the spectrum.
But Tom, wait a minute.
From allowing perhaps people who are in prison for a shoplifting offence, and someone who has committed murder who clearly no one would support their right to vote.
And that 4 years, I presume, could be determined by Westminster.
Well, that is the issue, and I think that really is where it stands. It should be done by Parliament.
So it will be.
And indeed, by the Human Rights Act does not actually bind the British Parliament. We can override it where we think it's necessary to do so.
That may be too. But it seems to me that in the end, Westminster will decide within the overall ruling that prisoners need the vote. And they could actually define it. They could say that anybody in prison for over a year shouldn't get the vote. They could make it quite narrow.
Andrew, I think there's a problem, which is that the case that in question is about manslaughter and a life sentence. Because they made it at that threshold level, I think it causes problems further downstream. Because if you say that that is what you're going to actually legislate about at the top level, then it more or less implies that it would be pretty well a blanket.
In the grand scheme of things, does it matter if prisoners have the vote or not?
I must say I'm not enormously excited by this issue. I think a pragmatic decision...
No, come on, Andrew.
I'm Andrew. He's Christopher.
I'm Christopher. That's all right. That's all right, Bill. Don't worry. Bill, yes. The European Court of Human Rights, that's another issue. And if the Lord Chief Justice starts to get worried about what's coming down from Strasbourg, then I think we have an issue.
Right.
But if we're going to pick a fight with Europe, and I sort of smell something emerging on my left here, then let's do it on something which is really important right now, and that is the budget in Europe.
Yes.
And how much is being spent, or at least proposed for expenditure by the Parliament. Well, that's where there is a legitimate battle to be fought.
Right.
Don't start him on that one.
He's off. He's off.
And we're gone.
But that's it.
It's like the Duracell bunny.
I know.
Right, we're off. We'll leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you very much.